Okay, why don't we get started? Good evening to all. I'm Dennis Nally, Chairman of PricewaterhouseCoopers International. Great to be here with you this evening. Thanks for joining. It's really great to have everybody here, as well as to see some old friends and some new faces here this evening. So great to be with you. I also want to extend a very special welcome to those that are participating via the webcast. I know there's many people following this press conference on the internet, so welcome to you as well. Feel free to send in questions as we go through the survey results. We're going to do our very best to make sure that we answer them after my short presentation. Before I want to get into the results, I just want to acknowledge and thank the more than 1,300 CEOs from 77 countries, 1,300 CEOs from 77 countries who participated in our 18th annual Global CEO Survey. And a particularly warm thank you to the 30 CEOs who really made a special effort, spent extra time with us to sit down with us and provide us with some really color commentary and more in-depth comments. There's no doubt that their contribution really makes a difference, and I think it makes the survey better and better every year. So thanks to all that participated. I also want to acknowledge several of our global leaders who are here with us tonight, who are available to answer any questions that you may have. Bob Moritz from the US, Bob. Ian Powell from the UK. Norbert Winkel-Johann from Germany, and Cassie Wong from China. All four of our senior leaders were here with us last year, so hopefully there's a familiar face. If you have any specific questions on those countries, territories, feel free to direct those questions to them. So I'm going to briefly take you through the survey highlights, which, as we all know, is focused on what's really needed to succeed in today's disruptive and very competitive global environment. And then I'll be happy to take any questions that you may have. If you're looking for specific country data points, we also have over 20 cuts of the survey data by country. So just ask. If we have it, we'll make sure that we make that available as well for some specific color commentary. So let's get started. Without question, the global economic recovery continues to be very fragile. In fact, CEOs, headline, are less optimistic this year about global growth than they were a year ago. In fact, only 37% of the CEOs in a survey think that the global economic growth will actually improve in 2015, and this is down from 44% last year. So the trend we saw in the past, which is increasing confidence over the last several years, obviously has been altered by thinking that they're looking at in terms of this year. Most importantly, 17% of the CEOs actually believe that the global economic growth will actually decline in 2015. And this is more than twice as many, 7% last year, that things would actually get worse. So again, more cautionary thinking coming from the CEOs this year versus just a year ago. Now, what's really interesting about this so far is that despite this global gloomy view that's out there in terms of the global economy, many CEOs actually believe that there are significant opportunities for their own business to grow. So just like last year, 39% said they are very confident that their company's revenue will grow in the year ahead. So you look at the 39%, actually pretty encouraging, notwithstanding the gloom-doom message around lack of confidence, which we think is pretty interesting. And that's up from 36%, as you can see on that slide, from a year ago. However, when we compare the CEO's thoughts on confidence in their own revenue growth to the prospects for global growth, we see that last year's CEOs had more confidence in the global economy than their own company. But this year, that trend has reversed, confirming the levels of uncertainty in the world today. And you can see that right in this category right here in terms of how the CEOs are thinking about their own company's growth versus the global economy. Not surprisingly, when we look at different regions around the world, confidence is really heavily influenced by where CEOs sit. And looking at the results by region, we can really see some interesting changes from last year. Asia Pac, continues to be the most confident region from a global economic perspective. The Middle East, at the top of the list last year, is still one of the most optimistic regions, which is interesting. However, I think it's worthy to note that this is down significantly, about 25 percentage points from last year. Obviously tied to what's happening with global crude prices, et cetera, that we're all familiar with. On the other hand, optimism in North America is on the rise, as you can see on this chart. And I think it's really important to emphasize that the CEOs who are based in Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe are the least optimistic in terms of short-term growth. So looking at individual countries, which is always interesting, with green indicating that confidence is up from last year and red confidence down, India actually tops the list with 62% of the CEOs confident about revenue growth. And not surprising, Russia sits at the bottom of the list at only 16%, which is really a dramatic reversal from last year when they were actually the most confident in the world looking at the past year. You know, it's really interesting to note as well, I think, that for the developed economies, the US, the UK, and Germany, confidence is actually up over the prior year. Another demonstration, I think, of the shift in confidence from the developing to the developed world. In terms of CEO confidence, for the first time, US confidence levels have exceeded China. So when you look at that, I think it's a pretty interesting trend as well in terms of what's happening between the US and the Chinese CEOs in terms of confidence levels of revenue growth. Without question, the decrease in Chinese CEO confidence is certainly a reflection of the plan to continue with the policies of economic reform as well as restructuring that we're all familiar with. And the idea being to deliberately slow growth to a level the authorities call the new normal is to support a more sustainable growth for the longer term. Now turning to the BRICS. Interesting scenario here. Formerly, as we all know, the powerful engines of expansion, they're now facing really different realities as each of these economies are moving in very, very different directions. And we look at the CEOs from the BRICS who feel very confident about short-term growth, all decreased from last year with the exception of India. Clearly, as we would suggest, the BRICS can no longer be treated as a single block of developing economies. Now, another important highlight, we believe, is when CEOs were asked to identify the most important countries for their organization's overall growth prospects for the first time in 5 years. That's right, for the first time in 5 years, they selected the US over China. Although China was still selected by over a third of the CEOs as a territory or a country to focus on. So let's turn to what's on the minds of the CEOs this year. While many see a lot of opportunities, 59% of them, that's right, 59% of them think there are more threats for their companies now than just 3 years ago. Doesn't say much about the direction of where the financial focus of the global economy is really headed. Again, topping the list of potential economic and policy social threats is regulation, which is noted by 78% of the CEOs. And to me, this is really, really an interesting trend. When you think about 2011 to 2014, 15, the significant increase of the concerns that the CEOs have about the whole issue of regulation. Without question, this is the highest level we've ever seen in the survey to date. And from talking to many of the CEOs, they're not just concerned about regulation that affects their industry, but importantly about issues that concern trade, taxes, employment law, and financial regulation, amongst others. Countries where concern about overregulation is the highest is particularly related to the US, Germany, the UK, as well as China. Now, the top business threats cited by CEOs are the availability of key skills, not a surprise when you look at that trend, but importantly, cyber threats and the lack of data security, which is rising rapidly from just last year when we first started to include this in the survey. Obviously, a key concern on the minds of CEOs today. We can also see that it's simply not economic fundamentals that are really affecting the CEO's confidence levels. Cyber threats, for example, are likely to become even more prominent in the wake of the recent high-profile attacks on the entertainment networks as well as others. Another top area of concern for CEOs, new to the survey this year, was the geopolitical uncertainty. Recent events suggest that this will actually carry forward in the year ahead with a negative influence on business confidence. So in the face of ever-growing sets of concerns, the question CEOs are asking, how can we really manage the day-to-day business while having the confidence as well as the vision to explore a much wider range of opportunities? Undoubtedly, businesses that want to grow profitably must rethink how they create value for their customers. In fact, over 50% of CEOs have entered a new sector or a subsector or are considering it in just the past 3 years. Technology, healthcare, and professional services top the list of favorite new business areas that CEOs are focused on. So what are CEOs really doing to succeed in this disruptive environment? Well, we found that CEOs are really focused on 3 areas. 1, creating value through transformation as well as technologies. 2, developing dynamic partnerships as well as alliances. And 3, finding new ways of working as well as thinking. CEOs know that they need to put technology at the core of their business. That's why when we asked them to list the most important strategies they're using to create more values, they cited mobile customer engagement as well as data analytics. In addition, CEOs are using partnerships to assess new technologies, new consumers, as well as new geographic markets. They are building alliances and developing more collaborative networks that include suppliers, customers, and business networks, and in some cases, we even see that happening with competitors. And finally, CEOs are focused on different ways of thinking as well as working. This includes diversity as well as inclusiveness, which are no longer seen as soft issues, but rather as a means to really gain competitive advantage. So to conclude, and before we open it up to questions, let me say that with all of the uncertainties that business leaders face today, it's a little wonder that when we asked the survey participants to name the one capability, that's right, the one capability that tomorrow's CEOs must have, the overwhelming response was adaptability. Shifts in global economic power are changing where CEOs seek growth. Changing consumer behaviors as well as technologies are disrupting entire industries. And in the future, there's every reason to believe that the pace of change will only increase. The good news here, and we think it is good news, is that the changes CEOs are making within their organizations right now have less to do with sheltering from the economic headwinds that we've been talking about, and more about building for the future. So beyond the serious concerns about overregulation, talent, as well as technology, it's encouraging that many CEOs believe if they can adapt to this changing scenario, a host of new business possibilities lie ahead. So these are some of the highlights of the PwC's 18th annual CEO survey. There's plenty more detailed information in the survey results. It's available not only in hard copy, but also on pwc.com, so I encourage you to take a look at that. I thank you for your attention, and most importantly, I want to thank all of those who really participated, in the webcast this evening. Now why don't we open it up the floor to questions? Yeah.
I'm curious why you think so few CEOs are concerned about climate change.
Well, I think they're concerned about it. I just don't think it's raised the level of short-term concerns that they're focused on over the next 12 to 18 months. I think it's certainly on the list of issues that they're concerned about. I think it comes through a little bit in the regulation issue, which is a lot of discussion, a lot of debate going on today about how to deal with climate change. Again, an uncertainty is the way I'd put it. And of course, that influences how they're thinking about confidence levels over the next 12 to 18 months. So I think it's there. I just don't think it's as prominent as maybe as some of the shorter term issues that they're really focused on in terms of the business, in terms of growth, in the foreseeable future. Other questions? Yeah, in the back here.
It's John Ho from China Central Television. You just mentioned several times that the CEO's confidence in China drops, and the U.S. overtake China in terms of the CEO confidence. I would like to know in what aspect, why the CEO's confidence drop. Is in terms of because of the economic growth, the slowdown of the economic growth, or because of other reasons. And also, you also mentioned that the new normal, which will be explained by the Chinese premier tomorrow,
right,
and whether it will build up the confidence of the CEO, like global CEO, it will build up the confidence.
Well, let me start, and then I'm going to ask Cassie to come on over and let her give you her perspective as well. The shift that we began to see a year ago, which was the move from the developing economies into the developed economies, the sense we have talking to many CEOs is that CEOs today are looking for environments that offer a fair amount of stability, and stability coming from whether it's the U.S., the UK, Germany, in terms of how those economies are continuing to evolve and to move. And I think what you see coming out of China today is a lot of reform, a lot of changes that carry with it a lot of uncertainty. And so even though the growth rates in China are, many countries around the world would love to have those kind of growth rates, so I think we need to acknowledge that. I think it's the issues around uncertainty that are affecting a CEO's thought process around confidence as well as investment. What was interesting about the CEO survey, one point from my perspective, was the U.S. was now the #1 destination point for investment this year. And I think that goes to this notion of stability, understanding of where those economies are, versus maybe uncertainty coming from some of the developing economies, including China. But Cassie, your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Hi. I think it's a very, very good question. We've been used to China being the darling in terms of growth. I think this year the survey is saying that CEOs are not pessimistic, but they are not as optimistic as before. I think this is a reflection that they do know they need to adapt to a reality, probably from two angles. The first angle is that the policy reform is going to take time to settle. And we know that the China government is really trying many different directions to stimulate the economy, but they will move away from a big stimulus package. So they would take a much more targeted approach that require good policy making, implementation, etc. That's going to take time. And the CEO need to adapt to it using Dennis' word. I think the second aspect is that China marketplace is very different from before now. It's highly competitive, it's very costly. And in China, a lot of the times we get used to the headline news of a disruptive business model. China consumers, the driver for domestic consumption, GDP growth, they are now using mobile technology a lot more. So every day we are reading with a lot of interest how business models are adapting or needed to adapt. And you've got the key players like the Baidu, the Alibaba, and the Tencent, whom are really forging a very different environment. So I do believe that the China CEO are becoming more concerned about how they adapt to capture the China growth. But having said that, I think the China CEOs are more eyeing on US market, the global market, to give them the elements of growth that they are looking for. And this is really the bright spot. I think the CEO survey are saying that the CEO are more optimistic longer term. I think this is because once they've adapted, they've got a long-term strategy, they are going back to a more optimistic view about the China market. So I hope this addresses your question.
I think it also points, the other point I'd make, final point maybe, is we all saw coming out of the financial crisis how connected these economies really are around the world. And obviously, as certain parts of the economies around the world slow, so for example, Europe, and you have a significant part of the Chinese business, export-wise, was going into that market, that affects the thought process in terms of how that's going to play out as you transition from that part to other parts of the development within the country. So I think that's another factor that needs to be put on the table in terms of how CEOs are really thinking about this.
You also mentioned that how do you explain the new normal you just mentioned?
I'll give you my words, and then Cassie, go right ahead. Why don't you go give your words first? Yeah.
Well, I think the new normal is clearly that China is not going to be in a double-digit growth or high single-digit growth. So the new normal, the premier, I'm sure you're going to be hearing more tomorrow. You're talking about the 7.5 or thereabout, plus or minuses. That's the sort of new normal. I think the second new normal is that services. If you look at the newly announced GDP figure for China, a lot of the growth, well, I would say more than previous years, is that the growth is coming from expansion of the services sector. This is what China needs, because manufacturing is taking up too much resources, too much, I think the environmentals and all that is not sustainable. So you're actually seeing that the new normal, the second new normal of China is going to be much more services-driven and consumption-driven. But thirdly, I think this is where Premier Li has been spending a lot of time in the policy making, leading the government in the policy making, is innovation. Of course, innovation is not a term that China is used to, but then we need to see China moving into a different era of innovation. Because with innovation, we can actually tap into the marketplace better, mobile technology, or even collaboration, encouraging the sectors to work together. And this is what we call the new normal in China. How long it's going to take to get there? Well, we have to show some confidence in it because we do believe that the China, with the private sectors, moving forward, the state-owned companies also reforming themselves, that they will try to deliver values to the shareholders and also to the country.
That's well said. And I would just, one final comment I'd add. When you think about the new normal, you're thinking about global economic growth, high 2s, low 3%. And so to me, that's at least a new normal for the near term anyways. And obviously, when you're dealing with an economy that historically has been so export driven, now needs to be much more consumer-based economy. Those are other factors that need, I think, come into play with the definition of new normal. Other questions? Yeah.
Your survey doesn't really talk about... Hi, I'm Supriya Srinath from ET Now, New Delhi, India. Your survey doesn't really talk about the crash in commodity prices. Are CEOs losing sleep over that? Because this obviously has repercussions on the deflationary trend that many economies are already witnessing.
It doesn't come through specifically in terms of commodities, is the way I'd put it. Obviously, when this survey was conducted, which was the fourth quarter of this past year, what was going on with energy was certainly back of mind, probably not as prevalent, I guess, is the way I'd put it in terms of today's thinking, in terms of what's happening with oil in particular. But it's a factor, that is clearly, being, considered. It impacts different countries and different industry sectors differently. Some would say, with what's going on with the price of energy, that this is really an economic dividend for many big consumers of energy, for example. Obviously, when you look at the impact on a country like Russia, it's having a very negative effect in terms of what that means to that economy. So it's starting to come through. I think you'll start to see it much more prevalent, as 15 sort of rolls out here. Other questions, comments? Maybe all the way in the back, and then we'll come up here, okay?
Vitas Trudavičius, Televisa. You mentioned about the cyber threats and its shooting in CEO's opinion. Also, at the same time, they are complaining about over-regulation. Do you reckon that could be the area where more global regulation is needed, cyber dangers?
Well, I certainly think it's an area where there needs to be very much a concerted effort between business and governments to deal with that particular issue. And as we all know, one of the big challenges that many companies have today operating in the global environment is how many of these regulations are not very well connected and coordinated, and that creates all kinds of issues and problems for companies that are really operating on a cross-border basis. But I think when you think about cybersecurity, cyber threats, this is an area that you will continue to see more dialogue, more debate taking place, hopefully on a very coordinated basis, because we all know the implications of this cross geographic boundaries when you're talking about cyber threats and securities. Up here, maybe?
Hi, thanks. Peter Goodman with the International Business Times. Just picking up on what you were saying about the interconnectedness of world economies post-financial crisis, to what degree does this confidence in U.S. growth prospects reflect a kind of failure to reckon with the many, or wishful thinking that the U.S. can continue sailing along at a time when so much of the rest of the world is dealing with real troubles?
Well, time will tell how that confidence level plays out. I think, again, the sense is that at least as it relates to that particular economy, you're dealing with, some would say, a more stable environment. Maybe Bob, I'll ask you to comment on that in a second in terms of some of the things that are going on within the U.S. economy. But sooner or later, as we all know, this global economy is connected, and it will have an effect. If Europe, for example, doesn't start to move to more of a growth-based economy, if some of the trouble spots around the world don't settle down, obviously, this will have an impact on the U.S. Outlook and the economy as well.
The increase in consumer confidence, as well as I'll call it the stability of what's happening from an economics perspective, is helping advance their confidence level. But likewise, the U.S. CEOs are probably demonstrating more ability to adapt to the disruption in the marketplace. So they are more likely, as you look at the statistics in the survey, to be adapting new and different technologies. You actually see that higher than other countries around the world. You see them actually doing more M&A, which comes from the confidence of economics, but also looking to transform their businesses differently. You see it in terms of how they're using digital to attack those consumers, or identify new talent, or create new partnerships that allow for innovation that ensures the sustainability of the business. So the confidence level coming from the U.S. CEOs comes from a couple different factors. One, inside the U.S., that's outside of their control, but also what they're doing themselves in terms of resiliency. Take it from the other side of the equation now, which is the confidence that other CEOs are having in the U.S., and therefore why it's actually eclipsed China right now. You see a consumer that has got its confidence level back, well-educated, willing to go aggressively, and willing to buy new and different things. You see a workforce that everybody's tapping into, and it's an innovative workforce that actually is working well in terms of the disruption that's happening. You see, in fact, while regulation is usually difficult, on a relative basis, lack of social unrest, I'll call it more stability than other countries, giving the CEOs around the world the confidence to invest in the U.S. So the combination of those two things put the U.S. at a higher level than it is today. Now, the question, as Dennis said, is one of time. The U.S. CEOs, and we saw this last year when we looked at the longer-term trends, are looking at demographic shifts and seeing the consumer in Asia. And as a result, they'll have to continue to invest outside. So when you ask those U.S. CEOs where they're investing, their number one investment area by a long shot is, in fact, China, followed then by Germany as you think about the stability coming out of that country, and then followed by the Southeast Asian countries. So that connectivity, clearly there, that dependency, clearly there, and it's a question of time in terms of how the equilibrium will actually play out.
Good. Thanks, Bob. Other questions? Up here? Yeah?
Ben Fazulin, Deutsche Welle. You mentioned adaptability being the number one capability. Did the CEOs actually tell you how adaptable they are?
Well, of course they're adaptable. They wouldn't have put that out there if they're not adaptable. I actually I think this is one of the big issues that many CEOs, boards are dealing with today. When you think about all the challenges and issues that we're all familiar with, right? Whether it's the geopolitical issues, the different hotspots around the world, the changing environments that are taking place that are driving business strategies. I think there's an acknowledgement that that if a company today can't adapt to that changing environment, their competitiveness is going to be called into question from a longer-term standpoint. I think there's an acknowledgement, quite frankly, from many CEOs that I speak with, that there's a whole host of issues that are out there today that are beyond the control of an individual company or a management team. And I think that speaks to the confidence levels in the global economic growth that was alluded to. However, when you think about confidence levels around the company's ability to grow and prosper, that's where this adaptability point comes into play, which is there are things that clearly are beyond the control of an individual company or a CEO. So let's not go focus on that. Let's be able to adapt, have some agility within the organization that as events unfold, we can react timely, we can shift investments, we can redeploy resources, et cetera, et cetera. It's that adaptability mindset that says if you are going to be competitive in this really dynamic environment, you're going to have that type of thinking. Now with that, I think goes some real challenges. One of the challenges I talk to the CEOs a lot about is even when CEOs can make that shift, that mental shift, in terms of making decisions, trying to move forward, you got governance mechanisms that are in place in many companies today that don't necessarily buy that type of a thought process. So that's an evolving way that boards and governance structures and investors need to be thinking about what I would describe as the new world order in terms of being able to really be competitive in this environment. We'll see a year from now how adaptable the CEOs in the survey really are. Yeah.
Ben Herschler with Reuters. I wonder if you can comment a bit on the Eurozone. It's obviously a fairly gloomy picture there, but we've got the ECB on the cusp of doing something, and that's been obviously in the works for a while.
Yeah.
Do you think that the pessimism reflects the fact that people don't have a huge amount of faith in the potential of a QE to move the dial?
Ian, have at it.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. That's a pretty big question. Look, I guess the developments over the last week have sort of increased uncertainty, and obviously that was way after we closed this survey. But I think it is really telling when you look at the survey that one of the biggest concerns that CEOs have got on a worldwide basis actually is geopolitical uncertainty. And I think when you look at the European CEOs and their particular cuts, if you like, of this survey, their confidence in the Eurozone is one of the most sort of areas of principal concern that they've got. So I guess, given that, what's happened over the last week is not going to enhance that at all. So I think there is a significant confidence point there. When you look at it, purely from a UK CEO's perspective, they see the biggest growth opportunities in the US, but they also see it second in Germany and then China. So Germany is quite interesting, I think, when you start to look at the Eurozone. It does seem to be the one area that CEOs sort of feel that they've got a relative sort of confidence in. So, I think we're going to have to wait and see, I guess, how the whole Eurozone area plays out. But there is definitely uncertainty there. And I think that's why CEOs, as I say, UK CEOs in particular, are looking to other markets. Eurozone clearly is our biggest market from a UK perspective. So that is sort of uppermost in people's minds. So I think they need an additional outlet. The other thing that I think is interesting is, in this survey compared to previous years, is that CEOs are looking much more to their domestic markets as well and investing in those domestic markets and seeing the growth in those domestic markets. I was going to pick up on one thing that we talked about a little bit earlier, which was this point about agility. I think it comes back to the talent point as well, because I thought that was a really interesting question. One of the themes, as you've probably seen in the survey, is just how concerned CEOs are about getting available talent. UK-wise, 84% of CEOs see the availability of talent as one of their biggest constraints on growth. That's up 20% on this time last year, and that is by far the largest. So in Germany, I think it was 54% of CEOs are concerned, and in France, it's about 37%. So UK see the talent issue as a really, really big issue. I guess that's because of the relatively high levels of employment in the UK at the moment. But I guess also it's as a result of the need for increased diversity. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of the agility that people will be looking for in terms of their leadership teams in the future are going to come through diversity as well. So when you dig deep into the survey and you get into that diversity point, I think you'll see CEOs are far more focused on diversity now than they were a few years ago, but see it as a really sort of key area for them, given the need for talent and also the need to be agile as well and creative.
Norbert, you want to comment on what's happening from an EU standpoint and
yes,
confidence levels, concerns, and
So yeah, yes, from the German perspective, especially, question is, yeah, we are at the moment still the stable factor in Europe, and question is how long this will stay. And there are, from my perspective, two answers. Yeah, one direction is that we are really underinvested. What belongs to infrastructure, this direction is really a big area where, yeah, we need probably to increase or come back to some deficit spending to cover that. On the other hand, question is really what are the next steps, and we have to realize that Germany is still, according to the products we have, an export nation. We are dependent on the economy in China and in the US, and as long this is in a good shape, I'm not concerned about the German situation that we cannot play this role as stable factor. So.
But it does come back to, I think, a point around, post-financial crisis, the degree of involvement by governments around the world in the economies is incredibly significant. And therefore, as long as there is debates going on with regard to, I would call it the political side of how to drive the growth agenda, that creates uncertainty from a business standpoint. And that is directly tied to, I think, the levels of confidence that we saw coming out of Western as well as Eastern Europe in terms of the CEOs and thinking about the next 12 to 18 months from a growth standpoint.
Yeah, and that leads to over-regulation there. That's a major concern from a European perspective as well, that over-regulation will really kill business developments.
Yeah, good. Do we have questions coming down the internet? Which ones?
You've covered them.
Okay, let's start with the first one. Do CEOs think they've invested enough in cybersecurity as well as data protection? I think just by the mere fact of how that level of concern increased in such a significant way in just 2 years in the survey demonstrates the concerns that the CEOs have. And every CEO I'm talking to today, I think others as well, top of mind issue, are we doing enough? What do we have to invest in for the longer term to really secure our networks, but recognizing they are dependent upon a whole host of other networks as well? Bob, you want to comment on it as well?
Yeah, sure. So as Dennis said, the cyber risk increased to an unbelievable level in a fairly short amount of time. And as you look at the country cuts, it's probably at the highest level where you already had a big issue that's been identified. And the US is just one small example of that. I would tell you that the CEOs don't believe they're investing enough right now. So actually, if you look in the details of the survey, you'll see that degree of concern in that 80, 90% level. But when you look at and ask the question, are your IT departments prepared for this? You're actually down now in the 50s, 60s, and 70 type of percent. So there's a big gap in terms of the degree of confidence that the CEOs have that we can actually deal with the issue. It gets into 2 points. First point, do we have the right talent? Comes back to that lack of needed talent and expertise that ultimately is there. Second, and Dennis alluded to this before, in the New World Order, do all elements of the management team and the governance bodies understand the risks in front of them? What do I mean by that? It's interesting today, a board probably has a different perspective and a lack of understanding around the cyber risks. They need to be educated very well. Is the risk around the threat of intellectual property being stolen? Is the threat financial in nature? Is the threat competitive in nature? Is the threat more geopolitical, that you as a company are actually trying to interact with government officials and you've got an issue of espionage going on? So understanding the threats, understanding then what companies do on a proactive basis and a reactive basis are the things that CEOs need to understand and educate their entire governance body in the chain of command, and do they have the right talent to go get it? And I think we see time and time again, and you see it today, many of the CEOs are putting that out there as a risk factor in their public statements, and they're also talking about the need for increased investment to get those technology skills into their place to actually shore up and bolster up their fortress mindset around that kind of particular risk.
Good. Thanks, Bob. Other questions? Maybe pick one from the internet here. Could you shed some light on why the emerging markets, regions, particularly Africa and Latin America, have low CEO confidence levels? Again, I would just say it is because of the environment, that many of those CEOs are looking at today, which is less stable than what it was just 12 months ago. And clearly that's impacting their thought process in terms of where there are the best opportunities to grow. You know, it's really interesting when you track this information over a period of years and you see the confidence levels that existed by the CEOs in those developing markets, in those emerging markets. They were incredibly high, you know, during the 5 to 6 year time period, even during the financial crisis that we were going through. And I think it's because of the way these economies are developing today, the journey that they're on, you know, as they start to, you know, adjust and react, that's impacting how CEOs are really thinking about the prospects, you know, as they look forward. And it'll be interesting to see how long that trend continues. I actually do believe at the end of the day, that big mega trend that we talk about, which is the shift of the global economy from the developed world to the developing world, is here. It's here to stay. It's just a question of how long it's going to play out as these economies, you know, adjust, settle down, you know, in the new world order. But it clearly is one that I think is impacting the CEO confidence levels coming out of the survey this year. Yeah, Ian, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Dennis, just to add as well, I think it comes back a little bit to the talent that's available as well. So, you know, if you look across Africa, there's a real need, and that came through strongly in the survey, a real need for really, you know, well-educated, experienced people in Africa. And obviously that is going to be a long-term challenge as well. I think when you look at the age profile of Africa, I think it is really interesting. There's something like, I think 40% of the population are under 15 at the moment. Well, when you think of the demographics in the rest of the world, with aging populations across many of the developed economies, the capacity to be able to produce really well-educated people through Africa and out to Africa is going to be really fundamental, I think, to the world economy in the future. But that is a long-term thing. So I think CEOs are looking 1 year out, they're looking 3 years out, they're not looking out beyond that. So in Africa at the moment, I think there's a talent issue. I'm not so sure on Latin America, but I suspect that also that's probably a talent issue as well, because I know Brazil is one of the best countries on earth in terms of all of its sort of resources that it's got inside its own boundaries, except for a really well-educated workforce. So I suspect that might be something of the concern, if you like, from a confidence perspective there as well.
Thank you. So let me bring this to a close. Thank you for coming this evening. Much appreciated. We'll have ample time. Many of us will hang around to answer any questions that you have. If you have further questions, I want to thank those that have been on the webcast as well for joining us this evening. Much appreciated. If you haven't had a chance to dig deep into the survey, it's rich with information. I think it's got a lot of great insights in terms of how the CEO community is really feeling about the next 12 to 18 months. Encourage you to do that, and happy to respond to any further questions as you have. Again, thanks for coming tonight. Much appreciated. Thank you.